I wonder, have you ever met the perfect Christian? Do you know the one? The one who gets up at 5 o'clock every morning to go downstairs and to pray for a couple of hours, maybe to read their Bible for an hour after that. The one who's in church every Sunday, never misses a day, even if they're on holiday. The one who gets the answer they want every time when they pray. Who's never had a problem in their life because God is taking care of them so much. The one who has an amazing testimony that they're only too willing to share, that makes everybody stop and think, makes everybody feel somewhat inadequate. The one who can fix their broken car just by laying their hands on it. Maybe you've met them, maybe you are them. But today we're going to think about other things. We're not going to think about perfect Christians, because actually I don't think there is a perfect Christian. I don't think we can get to perfectionism. And the problem is that trying to get to be perfect causes lots of problems for us. Not just in our Christian lives, but in life in general. You know, there's two types of perfectionism that people talk about. There's a neurotic perfectionism, which is perfectionism driven by ourselves, by what we think of ourselves. It's that perfectionism that says, I'll never measure up. And then there's a social perfectionism, which is where we're sensitive to a perceived failure. We're sensitive to what other people may think about us. And it's one that's driven, particularly at the moment, by what we see on social media, awful lot of which is not even true. And both of these are fueling a mental health crisis and leading to a huge increase in the number of suicides, particularly over the last year or so. And they're really dangerous. And as Christians, we're not immune from this if we strive for a degree of perfection that can only exist when we are ultimately joined with God. So today I want to look at people in the Bible who aren't perfect. They may have been perfectionists, but they're not perfect. People who had doubts, people who weren't sure what to do, people who we might look upon and say made mistakes, but people who at the end of the day were real Christians. And I hope that in looking at those, that you and I will be able to learn something from them and maybe feel a bit better about how we feel about ourselves. But first of all, we're going to sing, with thanks to Esther for leading that.
for this I have Jesus, for this I have Jesus, I have Jesus.
The first person we're going to look at is Thomas. Many people will know him as Doubting Thomas. It always seems to me a slightly unfair name, but nonetheless, it's the name that he's been given, and it's a phrase that's come into general usage, hasn't it? We talk about a Doubting Thomas. But the story about Thomas appears in John's Gospel, and it's in John chapter 20, starting at verse 24. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. I wonder whether Thomas is really any different to the rest of us. You know, we're pretty sceptical people generally, aren't we? And let's remember what happened here. Thomas had been following Jesus for the best part of 3 years. He'd seen him do miracles, of course. He'd seen him attract crowds of people. He'd listened to what Jesus had said. But had he really understood? The impression you get is that none of the disciples really had understood what was going to happen. So then, over the last week or so, he'd seen Jesus be arrested, be tried in a sham of a trial, really. He'd seen a crowd and maybe listened to the crowd shout for Jesus to be crucified. And then he'd seen Jesus hanging on a cross. And that was his last memory. That was his last memory of the person he thought was coming to be the Messiah. So when he's in their room, and all the other disciples say to him, "Thomas, we've seen Jesus, he's alive again." Are we really that surprised that he says, "Sorry, I'm not going to believe that. Unless I see it for myself, I'm simply not going to believe you"? I wonder would you and I have said anything different had we been in his shoes. It's interesting, isn't it, that they're in the upper room and we're told that the door is locked. They're still, even those disciples who've seen Jesus, they're still in a place that they feel safe. They still need to take that precaution of locking the door so that nobody can come in unexpectedly. I wonder too whether Thomas felt a little bit inadequate. I wonder whether he felt a little bit jealous. And there was a degree of defensiveness in his response when he said to the others, "Well, you may say you've seen him, but unless I see him myself, unless I put my hand into his hand where the nails were, unless I put my hand into the hole in his side where he was pierced with a spear, I will not believe you." You can imagine, can't you, that sense of defensiveness that came with it. And I wonder if you feel the same. Do you feel the same when you hear about miracles and you didn't see them? When it's outside of your experience? People tell you about something amazing that they've seen, something amazing that God's done, and you think, well, I've not seen that. And actually, I hear what you're saying, but unless I see it for myself, I'm simply not going to believe it. I feel like that sometimes, and I think actually it's a natural reaction. We want evidence, don't we? We're fairly rational people normally, and we want evidence of things. It's that classic thing, isn't it? When somebody says, "Don't touch that, it's hot," we still want to touch it to check. And we're the same. When somebody says, "I've seen this miracle happen," our immediate reaction maybe is to say, "Well, prove it. Show me." And certainly that would be the natural reaction for people outside of the church, people who aren't Christians. But you know, when I think of Thomas, it's what came next that was important. So there they are in the room, the door's locked, and Jesus appears among them again. And he says, "Peace be with you." And then he turns to Thomas, and I guess by this point Thomas is thinking, I'm in trouble here. And he says, "Thomas, put your hand in my hand. Touch me in the hole in my side." And Thomas falls to his knees and says, "My Lord and my God." And for me, that's the most important thing we can learn from Thomas. That we may have doubts, we may be unsure, we may ask for evidence, but at that point when we are confronted with the truth of the glory and the power and the amazingness of God as seen in Jesus, we need to be ready to respond just as Thomas did, and to acknowledge and to say, "My Lord and my God." The second person I want us to think about is Peter. You gotta love Peter. Peter, who we're told ultimately becomes the rock on which Jesus builds his church. But we see Peter as a disciple, and sometimes he just comes across as somebody who's ridiculously over-enthusiastic, frankly. He seems to be running about all over the place and eager to please. And I guess occasionally he must have got on the nerves of some of the other disciples. And this is that story of Peter walking on the water, or probably more so Jesus walking on the water, and Peter not quite getting there. And we can find it in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22. This is what it says. "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost!' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come onto the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink and cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, and the wind died down, then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" So there you are, in a boat, in the middle of the Lake of Galilee, and a storm comes up, the wind's blowing against you, and the boat's jumping about, and you look out, and you see a figure walking towards you. And it freaks you out, because it freaked out the disciples, because what they said is, "We've seen a ghost. Here's a ghost coming." They thought they'd seen a ghost, but of course it was Jesus walking on the water. And Peter's the first one to realise this. Peter kind of realises it. Maybe he's got this little bit of a test going on. So he says, "Jesus, if it's really you, then let me come to you. Let me walk out towards you." It's an amazing thing to say, isn't it? It's an amazing thing to say. Let me walk on water towards you, Jesus. But that's what Peter says. He wants to get out. He wants to walk on water himself, to be like Jesus, to walk towards Jesus. And Jesus says, "Well, fine, come." And Peter stands up, presumably, and he takes a step out of the boat. I wonder, did he step with some trepidation out of the boat, or did he confidently take that step? And then he takes another step out of the boat, and lo and behold, he's standing on the water. He begins to walk on the water, and then looks around. And I guess he had a moment where he thought, "I am standing on the water. What on earth is going on?" And as soon as he does that, He's not concentrating on standing on the water. He's not concentrating on Jesus. He sees the waves. He feels the movement of it. He feels the wind, and he starts to panic. As he starts to panic, so he starts to sink in the water, and he cries out to Jesus, "Save me, Jesus, save me." It's easy for us to say, why did he doubt when Jesus was right there in front of him? When he'd already taken that step out of the boat and he was standing on the water. Be easy to criticise Peter for that doubt and say, why couldn't you have been stronger? Why didn't you have that extra bit of faith that Jesus talked about? But again, what would you have done? Would you have even got out of the boat? I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure in the midst of all of that, I'd have been brave enough to say, I'll just step out of this boat and walk across and come and see you, Jesus. Perfectly natural thing to do. No, it's not. But that's what Peter did. And you know, fear, so let's face it, that's what happened to Peter. He became afraid when he saw the ridiculousness and the challenge of the situation that he was up against. He saw the wind, or he felt the wind, he saw the waves. He realised that what he was doing was completely unnatural. Fear overtook him. And it's at that point, once he takes his eyes off Jesus and he focuses on the fear that's there, that he starts to sink. And I think sometimes, and maybe too often, that's exactly what we do. We start out fixing our eyes on Jesus. We start out fixing our eyes on what Jesus has called us to do, to step out of the boat, to walk across the water to him, whatever our version of that is. Maybe we take that first step. Maybe we're brave in that first instance. But after that, we start to panic. We see everything that could go wrong, and we start to panic, and therefore we start to sink. But you know, there's a really important lesson we can learn from Peter here, and it's this. He got out of the boat. That's the most important thing. Okay, it may not have gone to plan after that, but at least he started. At least he tried. He had the courage to take that first step. And sometimes that is the hardest part. So that's something we can learn from Peter, is have the courage to fix our eyes on Jesus, to focus on what he's calling us to do, and be willing to take that first step and then place our trust in him. We're going to think about one more person, but we're going to have their song first.
There's a place where mercy reigns and never dies. There's a place where streams of grace flow deep and wide, where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in awe of you. I'm in awe of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white. I owe all to you. I owe all to you, Jesus. There's a place where sin and shame are powerless, where my heart has peace with God and forgiveness, where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing
person I want us to think about isn't named in the Bible. He's simply referred to as a man in the crowd. But I think he's got something important to teach us. So let's hear his story as found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 9. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "O unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for him who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the evil spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." How difficult must it have been for the father of that boy to see his son suffer so much for such a long time. He says he's been like it for a long time, since childhood. And it's caused him to be burnt. It's caused him to nearly be drowned. Must have been an incredibly difficult position for that father to be him. He must have really been at his wit's end. And when he goes to the disciples, he's heard all about what they can do. And he's filled with hope, one presumes, that they can bring some kind of relief, that they can offer some kind of help to his son. But they try and they can't. They make no difference. And I guess he must have been really crestfallen and really disappointed at that point and lost all hope, maybe doubted that anybody else could help him. And then Jesus says, "What are you all arguing about?" And he says to Jesus, "Well, I asked your disciples to help heal my son, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it." And then Jesus has this conversation, and then Jesus says these lines to him. He says, "If you can, everything is possible for him who believes." And the Father has what I think is this most honest response. He says, "I do believe, help me to overcome my unbelief." I love that phrase. I love that phrase because for me it talks about how I often feel. I can say wholeheartedly, I do believe, but I know that there's part of me that has kept hold of that unbelief in certain situations and doesn't necessarily feel that everything is possible as Jesus says. And I need Jesus' help to overcome that in the same way that the father of the son needed Jesus' help. As he says, "Help me overcome my unbelief." So if that's where you find yourself, if you find yourself in the same situation sometimes saying, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief," don't worry about that. Don't be concerned about that. Don't be afraid that in some way you've stopped being a perfect Christian, to come back to our beginning. It's perfectly fine to reach out to Jesus and to say, "Help me overcome my unbelief." So what do we learn? What do we learn from these three people? I think we learn a number of things. I think we learn that it's normal to be skeptical. That's a difficult word. It's normal to be skeptical But when we're confronted by evidence and when we're confronted by truth, then we need to acknowledge God's power and God's truth in the same way that Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." We need to recognise that sometimes fear can cripple us and can stop us moving forward, can take our eyes off Jesus and everything he's calling us to do. But we need to be brave enough to at least take that first step, to step out of the boat as Peter did, and who knows what might happen next. And when we want to believe but we find it difficult, we can reach out to Jesus. We can confess that we want to believe but we need his help with our unbelief. So I'll leave you with those three thoughts. Acknowledge God's power and truth when confronted with it. Grasp the fear, take the first step, and don't be afraid to say to Jesus, "Help me with my unbelief and with my doubts." Amen.
In my wrestling and in my doubts, in my failures you won't walk out. Your great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled seas. Oh, you are the peace in my troubled seas. In the silence you won't let